The door slammed before she could finish her sentence. For a moment, Margaret just stood there, her hand still resting on the cool brass knob, frozen in disbelief. The echo of the door closing seemed to stretch across the quiet suburban street, bouncing off manicured lawns and mailboxes lined in neat rows. It wasn't just a door closing, it felt like something inside her had been shut out too. Inside the house, she could still hear Emily's voice, sharp and trembling. "You can't just walk in whenever you want, Margaret. This is our home. You need to call first." Margaret swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in her eyes. The autumn air was crisp, and for the first time that day she realized how cold it felt on her skin. She took a small step back from the porch, glancing up at the second-story window where the curtains shifted slightly. Maybe her son Daniel was watching. Maybe he'd come out. Maybe he'd say something, anything. But he didn't. Instead, the silence thickened. A silence that spoke louder than words ever could. She tightened her cardigan around her shoulders the way she used to when Daniel was a boy and storms frightened him. Only this time there was no storm outside, just one inside her chest. Margaret walked slowly down the front steps, the hem of her pale blue skirt brushing against her ankles. Her old sedan was parked a few houses down. The short walk to it felt endless. Each step echoed with questions she couldn't quite form, the kind that start with, "How did it come to this?" When she finally reached the car, she looked back at the house, the home she'd helped them buy. She remembered the days she'd written that check, $30,000 from her savings. It felt right. After all, she was helping them build a life. That's what mothers do. They give, they make space, they show up. Now it seemed showing up was the problem. She climbed into the car, shut the door softly this time, and just sat there. Her fingers trembled on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, she could still see the house. The porch light flicked on, automated, efficient, modern. Everything Emily loved. Everything that reminded Margaret how outdated she must seem in their world. A light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the glass. It blurred the edges of her view, softening the sharp corners of the home. Margaret exhaled slowly, her breath fogging up the window. In that moment, it looked as if the house itself were slipping away from her, dissolving into something distant, unreachable. She turned the key, but the car didn't start immediately. The old engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. She pulled away slowly, headlights sweeping across the driveway one last time before fading into the dark. Back in her own house, quiet, neatly kept, but empty, Margaret hung her cardigan on the same hook she always had. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked louder than usual. It was 6:17 p.m. dinner time. She'd planned to bring over a casserole she made from scratch, the same recipe her mother had taught her in 1965. She thought Emily might appreciate it, or at least Daniel would. Instead, the casserole sat cooling in the passenger seat of her car. She stood by the counter for a long time, staring at nothing. The phone sat there dark and still. No call, no message, just the faint reflection of her face on the black screen, lined weary and questioning. Finally, she whispered to herself, "Maybe I should have called." The words felt foreign, almost foolish. How could calling ahead be necessary? This was her son's home. Her son, the boy who used to run to the window every time her car pulled up. The boy who'd once said, "Mom, promise you'll always come over no matter what." She had kept that promise, perhaps too well. Margaret walked to the living room and sank into her armchair. The floral fabric creaked beneath her. On the coffee table sat a framed photo, Daniel as a teenager, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at some long-forgotten joke. He looked so happy then, so close. She traced his face with her fingertip, her heart swelling with the old ache of pride and loss. How quickly children grow, she thought, how quietly they drift away. The rain outside thickened. It pattered against the windows in steady rhythm, a lullaby for the lonely. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening. Her mind replayed the sound of Emily's voice, sharp, impatient, but also scared, no, defensive. That's the word. Defensive. What was she defending? Her home, her space, her independence. Margaret tried to see it from her perspective, but every angle hurt. She wasn't trying to take over, she wasn't trying to intrude. She just wanted to help fold some laundry water the plants, maybe hold the baby when the time came. It was love, simple, genuine, perhaps clumsy, but love all the same. Then why did it feel like rejection? She rose from the chair restless and walked to the window. Across the street, porch lights flicked on one by one. Other families were gathering at dinner tables, laughing, passing plates, sharing stories of their day. She used to have that. She used to belong to that rhythm. Now she was a visitor, an outsider in the life she'd once built. Her gaze fell to her own front yard. The grass was trimmed, the flowers neat, the mailbox freshly painted. But there were no toys, no bicycles, no small shoes left by the door. Just stillness, just her. Hours later, she sat in bed with a book open but unread. Her eyes lingered on the same paragraph for minutes at a time, but the words blurred together. At 9:46 p.m., her phone finally buzzed. Her heart leapt. It was a message from Daniel. "Hey, Mom. Sorry about earlier. Emily's just stressed. We'll talk soon. Love you." 3 sentences. No call. Just text. She stared at it for a long while before typing back, "It's okay, sweetheart. I understand. Take care of her." Her finger hovered over the send button. Then she deleted, "It's okay, sweetheart." Rewrote, "No worries. Dinner's on me next time." She added the smiley face because that's what people did these days to make things seem lighter, kinder, less real. She hit send. The phone screen dimmed again, reflecting her face once more, and in that soft glow she saw the truth settle over her. Some doors don't slam out of anger, some close because love doesn't know where to stand anymore. The morning after the door slammed, the house felt different, still neat, still bright, but emptier somehow, like a museum of memories, not a home. Margaret moved through the kitchen like someone walking in a dream. Every sound, the click of the coffee maker, the clink of the teaspoon, the quiet hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than usual. She sat down at the small breakfast table by the window, her coffee untouched, and stared out at the street. The world outside carried on as if nothing had changed, a man jogging with his dog, a delivery truck rolling past, the neighbor waving as she watered her lawn. But inside, everything had shifted. Her son's voice still echoed faintly in her mind. "Mom, please. Emily just needs space." And Emily's voice trembling, sharp, younger, but filled with certainty. "You can't just walk in whenever you want." Margaret's hand shook slightly as she reached for the mug. She wasn't angry, not exactly. She was confused, heartbroken in a way that didn't come from betrayal but from misinterpretation. She hadn't meant harm. She never did. She only wanted to help. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time not long ago when her help had been wanted, even needed. She could still recall that first day Daniel had brought Emily home. It was a bright spring Saturday, the air thick with the smell of lilac and cut grass. Margaret had spent the entire morning cleaning the house, baking a pie, and setting out her best china. She wanted everything perfect, not because she needed to impress, but because she wanted her son's happiness to feel at home here. When the doorbell rang, she smoothed down her lavender blouse and took a deep breath. Emily stood there, elegant, poised, the kind of young woman who carried herself like she belonged in a glossy magazine. Her handshake was firm, her smile polite, and her perfume smelled faintly of something floral but expensive. "Mrs. Collins, it's so lovely to meet you," Emily had said. "Please call me Margaret," she replied warmly, "and welcome to our home." They had lunched together, and Margaret remembered thinking how different Emily was from herself, confident, career-focused, modern, the kind of woman her generation had fought for but rarely been allowed to become. It wasn't that she disliked her. On the contrary, she admired her, but she also couldn't help but feel a small pang of distance, as if they were two ends of a bridge that didn't quite meet. When Daniel told her he planned to propose, she cried, not out of sadness, but out of joy. Her boy, her only child, was finally starting his own life. And yet, as she stood in the church months later, watching him slide the ring onto Emily's finger, A flicker of realization passed through her heart like a shadow. He doesn't need you the same way anymore. It wasn't jealousy. It was something quieter, the gentle grief that comes when your purpose begins to fade. After the wedding, things moved quickly. They bought a small house just 15 minutes away. Margaret was overjoyed. She had imagined family dinners every Sunday, helping with chores, watching them grow into the kind of couple she and her late husband once were. In the beginning, it was lovely. Emily had asked for help unpacking for advice on curtains and cookware. Margaret had offered her mother's old recipes tips on removing stains, even brought over a few potted plants to make the porch feel homier. It felt like being needed again, like having a place. But once everything was set up, Emily's tone began to change just slightly. When Margaret offered to come by, Emily would say, "Oh, that's kind, but we've got it handled." Or Daniel would add gently, "Mom, don't overwork yourself. You should rest. Rest." How could she rest when she'd spent her whole life doing it, when every part of her being was built around care, service, and presence? Still, she tried to listen. For a while. Then one afternoon, when Emily caught the flu, Margaret couldn't help herself. She cooked chicken soup, drove straight to their house, and knocked softly. Daniel opened the door, surprised but grateful. "Mom, that's really sweet," he said, kissing her cheek. But from the bedroom, she heard Emily's tired voice. She didn't call first. Margaret had laughed awkwardly, brushing it off. "I just wanted to help." Emily didn't respond. That night, as she drove home, she told herself Emily was just ill. People get snappy when they're sick. But something about the tone had lodged deep in her chest like a splinter. Then came the casserole incident. She'd made it from scratch, her late husband's favorite recipe. It was one of those meals that carried history, warmth, memory. She wanted to share that with them. When she arrived, Emily answered the door mid-call, phone pressed to her ear. "Oh, hi, Margaret," she said, smiling tightly. "Can you just leave it on the counter? I'm on a work call." Margaret froze in the doorway. "I thought maybe we could have lunch together," she said quietly. Emily hesitated, eyes darting toward the hallway. "I'm sorry, not a good time right now. Maybe another day." The door closed gently behind her, but in Margaret's ears it sounded like finality. She stood there for a few seconds, casserole dish in hand, before turning away. When she reached her car, she realized she'd forgotten her gloves inside. She didn't go back. That evening, she ate alone, slicing a piece from the extra casserole she'd made for herself. It tasted fine, but somehow empty. That's when she began to notice how quiet the house had become, how rare Daniel's visits were, how every phone call seemed shorter, every message more delayed. The silence wasn't just in her kitchen, it was in her chest, and it grew louder with every passing day. The days turned to weeks. Margaret kept telling herself things would go back to normal. Families fight, they heal. But deep down, she sensed it, a slow shifting of the earth beneath her feet. She wasn't the center anymore. She was in orbit. And love, she realized, can't survive long in orbit. It drifts and drifts until you can't tell if you're moving closer or farther away. 2 weeks passed before she saw them again. It was Daniel who called, his voice bright but cautious, like someone stepping carefully across a cracked floor. "Hey, Mom," he began. "We're hosting a little get-together on Saturday. Some of Emily's coworkers. Thought you might want to stop by." Her heart fluttered. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was an invitation, a bridge. "Of course, sweetheart," she said quickly. "What can I bring?" "Oh, nothing, really," Daniel replied. "Just come and relax. But old habits die hard." "Maybe I'll make my lemon pie," she offered. "It's your favorite." He paused for half a beat. "Sure, that'd be nice." That hesitation, so small, so quick, echoed in her ears long after the call ended. Saturday came bright and golden, the kind of day that made the whole neighborhood seem alive. Children on bikes, dogs barking, sprinklers misting over trimmed lawns. Margaret took extra care getting ready, her hair brushed smooth, her floral blouse neatly ironed, a touch of rose-colored lipstick. She placed the pie carefully in the passenger seat, wrapped in a checkered towel. As she drove, her heart fluttered between hope and worry. This was her chance to make things right, to show she could belong, that love didn't have to mean control. When she reached the house, laughter floated through the open windows. Music drifted faintly from inside. She smiled, comforted by the sound of life. But when Emily opened the door, surprise flickered across her face. "Oh, hi, Margaret. You're early." Margaret held up the pie, smiling. "I thought I could help set up." Emily hesitated. "That's sweet, but we're mostly ready." Then, catching herself, she added quickly, "Come on in." The living room was filled with people, young professionals, chatting easily about work vacations and things Margaret didn't quite follow. She placed the pie on the counter beside a tray of charcuterie and bottles of imported wine. Her old glass dish looked oddly out of place, like a relic from another time. She moved through the room, smiling, introducing herself. "I'm Daniel's mom," she said to a small group. "Oh," one woman replied, polite but distracted. "You made the pie right. That looks amazing." Margaret nodded her smile, trembling slightly. "It's his favorite." The woman just nodded, already turning back to her conversation. Across the room, Daniel caught her eye and grinned. "Hey, Mom." He hugged her briefly, then excused himself to help a guest. Emily floated nearby, graceful and composed, laughing easily. Margaret tried to join a few conversations, but every word felt foreign, every topic just out of reach. When it came time for a toast, Emily raised her glass, voice bright. "Thank you, everyone, for being part of our little home," she said. "It's been a year full of learning, growth, and setting boundaries." Soft laughter filled the room. Everyone nodded knowingly. Margaret forced a smile, but something inside her tightened. Boundaries. That word again. The polite way of saying keep out. She lifted her own glass, a half-empty one Daniel had poured, and took a slow sip. The bubbles burned her throat. Later, she slipped into the kitchen for some air. The chatter faded behind her. On the counter, her lemon pie sat untouched. Around it, fancy canapes and sparkling water bottles gleamed under the lights. She brushed a hand along the dish's edge. The crust was perfect golden and flaked just like she used to make for Daniel when he was 10. Back then, he'd sneak a slice before dinner, grinning as crumbs fell down his shirt. "Don't tell Dad," he'd whisper. And she never did. Now the pie might as well have been invisible. From the next room, she heard Emily's voice, light, confident. "It's funny. My mom always said once you get married, you have to make your own rules. Otherwise, people just show up whenever they want." More laughter. Margaret stood, frozen hand trembling on the dish. It wasn't said with malice. It wasn't even meant to hurt, but it landed just the same. She drew a slow breath, blinked back tears, and stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was cool, laced with the scent of lavender and rain. Inside, the laughter continued, bright and distant, a world she could see but no longer enter. When Daniel came out 10 minutes later, she'd already gathered her purse. "Leaving so soon?" he asked gently. She smiled, brushing his cheek. "It's been a lovely evening. You and Emily have built such a wonderful life." He hesitated, sensing something. "Mom." "I don't worry," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." He hugged her, and for a moment she let herself sink into it, the warmth, the familiarity, the memory of a boy who once clung to her hand. Then she stepped back, gave a small wave, and walked down the path toward her car. As she drove home, city lights blurred across her windshield, streaks of gold and silver melting into one another. She thought about that house, so full of sound, so full of people, and how she'd never felt lonelier than she did standing in the middle of it. Love, she realized, wasn't enough to guarantee a place in someone's life. Sometimes the more you love, the less room you're given. And somewhere between all the giving and all the caring, she had forgotten that love, too, needed permission. Margaret didn't mean to overhear. It happened 2 weeks after the party on a calm Thursday afternoon, when she decided against her better judgment to drive past Daniel's neighborhood. She told herself she wasn't going to stop. She only wanted to see the trees, how the maple leaves were beginning to turn red. That street lined with young families and bicycles always made her smile. She slowed the car as she passed their house. The driveway was empty except for Emily's sleek silver SUV. The porch light was off. She should have kept driving, but something inside her whispered, "Just check. Just make sure they're okay." Before she could talk herself out of it, she parked at the curb. The front garden looked lovely, new hydrangeas, a tiny flag staked by the mailbox, a small welcome mat she hadn't seen before. She smiled faintly. Maybe Emily was warming up to the idea of making a home. Margaret had given her that mat last Christmas, though Emily hadn't used it then. Maybe she finally came around, Margaret thought, feeling a quiet flicker of hope. She picked up the small package of baby blankets she'd crocheted the night before. They didn't have children yet, but she wanted to be ready. Daniel had once joked, "You'll be the best grandma mom," and she would be, she just needed the chance. She stepped up to the porch, intending only to leave the gift by the door. Then she heard voices inside, muffled but tense. At first she thought it was the television, but then she caught Daniel's voice. "I didn't tell her because I knew she'd overreact." Emily's voice followed sharper. "Daniel, it's not about her feelings this time. It's about us. We can't keep letting her show up. She doesn't understand boundaries." Margaret froze. The package trembled in her hands. "She just wants to help." Daniel said, his tone weary. "No, she wants to control," Emily shot back. "You didn't see her face at the party. Every time I spoke, she looked like I was stealing something. I can't live like that." Silence. Then Daniel sighed. "She's my mother. And I respect that," Emily said softly but with finality. "But if we ever want to start our own family, we need space, not constant visits, not guilt trips, not unannounced drop-ins." Something shattered inside Margaret, quiet but deep, like a crack forming in glass. She stepped back, heart pounding. The baby blanket slipped from her grasp, tumbling onto the mat. For a second, she thought about knocking, explaining, apologizing, but her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't walk in again, not after hearing that. She turned and hurried down the path, eyes blurred. The autumn wind stung her cheeks as she reached her car. She sat inside for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her reflection stared back from the windshield, pale, startled, smaller somehow. "They don't want me," she whispered. It wasn't said with bitterness, just realization. A truth landing like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything she believed. That night, the silence in her house felt unbearable. She turned on the TV for background noise, flipping through channels, but every cheerful sitcom and home renovation show felt like mockery. She tried reading, but the words blurred. She tried calling a friend, but hung up halfway through dialing. Eventually, she found herself sitting in her late husband's old armchair. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dust. His picture sat on the mantel, smiling, strong, frozen in time. She stared at it for a while. "Robert," she whispered, "I don't know how to stop caring." The photo didn't answer, but in her heart she imagined what he'd say. He'd always been gentler, more measured. "You love too loudly," he once told her. "Sometimes love whispers, Maggie. Not every kindness needs to be heard." She'd laughed then, but now the words pressed against her chest like a weight. She closed her eyes, letting tears slip down quietly. For the first time, she began to understand her love, constant, visible, physical, belonged to a world that no longer existed. A world where doors were always open and mothers never had to ask before stepping inside. Now love has rules. And she hadn't read the manual. The next morning, she found the blankets still in the passenger seat, small, soft, untouched. She folded them carefully, placed them in a drawer beside old birthday cards and faded school drawings. Then she took a deep breath and decided, no more visits, no more showing up. If they needed her, they'd call. It was harder than she imagined. Days stretched long without the small rituals, checking in, dropping off meals, walking through aisles at the grocery store, thinking Emily might like this. She forced herself to stay busy. I joined a gardening club. I volunteered at the library. But no matter what she did, she found herself glancing at the clock around dinner time, half expecting the phone to ring. It rarely did, and each night as she locked the doors and turned off the lights, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for forgiveness, but for relevance. "Please," she murmured, "just let them still need me." By November, the air had grown cold. The trees outside her window stood bare, their branches scratching lightly against the glass when the wind blew. Thanksgiving was only 2 weeks away, and everywhere she went, people talked about family recipes, travel plans, reunions. For years, Thanksgiving had been hers. Her kitchen, her table. Daniel would bring friends from college. Emily once came as a guest, and Margaret had loved setting a place for everyone, even the unexpected. She'd roast the turkey herself, wake before dawn to baste, and season fill the house with the smell of butter and rosemary. But this year no one had called. She waited, thinking maybe Daniel was busy, that he'd mention it soon. But when she finally worked up the courage to ask, his voice on the phone was gentle, almost rehearsed. "Mom, we're going to Emily's parents' place this year. They haven't seen us in a while." Margaret smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Oh, of course. That makes sense. We'll do something together soon," he promised. "Maybe next month." "Of course," she echoed, but the words soon felt thin, stretched across a distance she couldn't bridge. After the call, she stood in the kitchen staring at the empty dining table, the same table that once seated 10, now just one. She ran her hand over the polished surface, catching the faint scratches where Daniel as a child had pressed too hard with his crayons. She'd meant to sand them out years ago. Now she was glad she hadn't. They were proof he'd been here once. That night, she dreamed of the past. She saw Daniel at 6 years old, flour dusting his cheeks as he helped knead dough. "Like this, Mom, perfect," she said, laughing. "You're a natural." Then the image blurred and he was older, graduating high school, hugging her tightly. "Don't cry, Mom. I'll call every day." But the calls grew fewer, the hugs shorter, and when she woke, her pillow was damp. Days slipped by, marked by the ticking clock and the mailman's footsteps. Margaret tried to keep herself occupied, sorting old photos, donating clothes, baking small batches of cookies. She ended up freezing because there was no one to eat them. She told herself she was fine. She had her health, her home, her memories. But every evening as she sat alone at the dinner table, she felt the quiet stretch around her soft patience suffocating. It wasn't anger she felt. It was absent. The absence of laughter, of footsteps, of purpose. Sometimes she caught herself speaking aloud, commenting on the news, or muttering a recipe step just to hear another voice. It startled her how quickly silence can turn into company. One afternoon, she walked through the park near her house. Children played on swings, their parents calling out from benches. A young woman pushed a stroller, laughing at something her husband whispered. Margaret watched, her chest tightening with something between longing and pride. A little boy ran past her, nearly tripping. She reached out instinctively to steady him. "Careful, sweetheart," she said gently. The boy grinned up at her. "Thanks, lady." His mother called from across the field. "Eli, say thank you." He waved once, then ran off. Margaret smiled faintly, though her eyes stung. She sat on a nearby bench, clutching her purse in her lap. She'd raised a child once. She knew what it meant, the sleepless nights, the scraped knees, the first words, the first heartbreak. And now, he was someone else's world. She wanted to be proud. She was proud, but pride alone didn't fill the empty chair at her table. That evening, a text arrived from Daniel. "Hey, Mom. Emily's been meaning to call you. She's been busy with work. Hope you're okay." She stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering above the keyboard. "I'm fine," she typed back. "Tell her not to worry." Then after a pause, she added, "I made your favorite cookies today. They're in the freezer. Maybe next time you visit." He replied with a heart emoji. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, she passed the nursery. She'd once planned a small spare room where she'd imagined cribs and lullabies. She'd started painting it pale yellow last year before she realized no one had asked her to. The walls were still half finished, a brush sitting dry in a corner. She stepped inside, touching the cool paint. The color looked soft in the lamplight, like sunlight trapped in silence. "Maybe I should finish it," she murmured, "even if it's just for me." As she stood there, a memory came uninvited, her own mother years ago telling her, "You'll see, Maggie. The hardest part of motherhood isn't letting them go, it's realizing they don't look back." At the time she'd laughed. Now she understood. That night she sat at her kitchen table and began writing a letter, not a message, not a text, a real letter, the way she used to. Her handwriting is shaky, her words simple. "Dear Daniel, I hope you're both doing well. The house is quiet, but that's all right. I'm learning to enjoy it. I don't want you to feel guilty or torn. I know life changes, and that's okay. Just promise me one thing. Don't let the years pass before we share another meal, because love, my darling, doesn't disappear. It just waits. Love always. Mom. She sealed the envelope, set it by the door. Tomorrow she'd decide whether to send it. Tonight she just needed to know it existed, that her love still had somewhere to go. As she turned off the lights and walked down the hall, the quiet didn't seem as heavy. It was still there, yes, but softer, more patient, almost like an old friend sitting with her in the dark. It began with something small, a faint dizziness while watering the plants, the world tilting slightly beneath her feet. Margaret brushed it off at first. She hadn't eaten breakfast. She'd been up late reading, nothing serious. But the spells came again, standing, reaching, bending. Her body swayed like an old tree in the wind. She told no one. Not Daniel. Not even the neighbor who waved from across the lawn. She didn't want to be a burden. She'd spent her whole life being needed. She didn't know how to be helped. That Tuesday morning, she woke early to a soft rain, the kind that whispered against windows, gentle but persistent. She decided to bring in the newspaper herself, though the driveway was slick. Her slippers slipped once, twice, but she steadied herself. On the third step, her foot caught the edge. The world tilted. The paper slipped from her hand, and before she could reach for the railing, the ground rose up to meet her. When she woke, the room was white and humming, beeping monitors, a faint antiseptic smell. Her head throbbed, her arm ached. It took a moment for her to realize she was in a hospital. A nurse leaned over her. Mrs. Collins, you had a fall. You've been out for a few hours. Margaret blinked. Who called your neighbor found you, the nurse said gently. She heard something outside. Margaret tried to sit up, but the nurse pressed a hand to her shoulder. Easy. You hit your head and your arm's fractured. You'll need rest. The word fractured landed harder than she expected. It wasn't just her arm, it was everything. Daniel arrived an hour later, breathless, face pale. Mom, oh my God, are you okay? He took her hand, his grip trembling. Emily followed behind, holding a bouquet of lilies. Her smile was tight, uncertain. I'm fine, Margaret lied softly. It's just a bump. The doctor entered, explaining the injury, a mild concussion, a clean fracture. She'll need someone to check in for a few days, he said. Daniel nodded immediately. We'll handle it. Emily's face flickered. We'll figure something out, she said, though her tone wavered between kindness and hesitation. Margaret saw it, the small pause, the subtle exchange of glances. She didn't blame them. They had jobs, lives, things to manage. Still, the thought of going home alone filled her with quiet dread. Back at her house, Daniel helped her inside, one arm around her shoulders. Emily followed, placing the lilies in a vase. For a moment, the house felt full again, voices, movement, care. Mom, you really scared us, Daniel said. Why didn't you call someone? Margaret smiled faintly. It didn't seem worth the trouble. The trouble, he repeated, incredulous. You could have been seriously hurt. I know, she said, voice soft. But you've both been busy. I didn't want to interrupt. He opened his mouth and closed it again. The silence stretched between them like fog. Emily stepped forward, adjusting the flowers. You should have told us, Margaret. We'd have come. Margaret looked at her, at the concern behind those tired eyes, and for the first time she saw not a rival but a woman stretched thin, trying to hold everything together. I know, Margaret whispered, and I'm sorry. For the next few days they stopped by. Daniel took time off work. Emily brought groceries and tidied the kitchen. The gesture warmed her, yet also embarrassed her. Every thank you felt like surrender. Every offer of help reminded her she'd once been the one doing these things for others. One evening, as Emily reheated soup, Margaret said quietly, You don't have to stay. I can manage. Emily looked up from the stove. It's fine, Margaret. Really. But Margaret caught the flicker of exhaustion in her face. You've been kind enough, she said softly. Go home. Be with Daniel. Emily hesitated. Then almost reluctantly she smiled. All right, but promise you'll rest. Margaret nodded. After she left, the silence returned gentler now, like a companion. She sat by the window arm in a sling, watching headlights pass. Somewhere inside, a small shift began, not loud, not sudden, a realization that maybe love wasn't about being there all the time. Maybe it was about trusting others to love in their own way. Still, when she turned off the lamp that night, she whispered softly into the dark, I miss when he needs me. The next morning, a knock came at the door. It was Emily again. Goodness, you'll wear yourself out, Margaret said, surprised. I brought muffins, Emily said, holding up a paper bag, and coffee. They sat together at the table, awkward at first, then easier as the minutes passed. Emily asked about the plants, the neighbors, the crocheting. Margaret listened, nodding, answering simply. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then Emily sighed, glancing around the quiet house. It's so peaceful here. Sometimes I wish I had your calm. Margaret smiled faintly. Calm can be lonely. Emily looked at her, the truth sinking in. For the first time, Margaret saw her soften, truly soften, not as a polite guest, but as a woman realizing another's ache. I'm sorry, Emily said finally. Margaret blinked. For what? For being distant, she said. I didn't realize how much you were trying. The words were simple, but they cracked something open. Margaret reached across the table, her good hand brushing Emily's. We both tried, dear. We just forgot to listen. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain tapped lightly on the window, and in that stillness, something fragile but real began to mend. By the following week, Margaret could move around better. Her arms still ached, but she'd learned to adapt one-handed tea, careful steps, slower days. Daniel stopped by after work to fix a loose railing. Emily brought more groceries. The house began to smell faintly of cinnamon and coffee again, yet something inside her felt changed. She still missed the past, but she'd stopped chasing it. The silence no longer felt like punishment. It was space, space to breathe, to think, to heal. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, she found the unsent letter she'd written weeks ago folded neatly inside a cookbook. She opened it, rereading the words she'd once written in loneliness. Just promise me one thing, don't let the years pass before we share another meal. She smiled sadly. She'd meant it as a plea back then. Now it felt like hope. Without overthinking, she picked up a pen and added a line. And if we ever forget each other, let love be the one to remind us. She set it aside, not to send, but to keep. Some words she decided were meant for the heart, not the mailbox. Later that week, Daniel came by alone. He looked tired, his tie-loosened eyes rimmed with fatigue. He dropped onto the couch beside her. How's the arm? He asked. Getting there, she said. I'm a terrible patient. He smiled faintly. You've always been terrible at sitting still. They shared a laugh, soft, familiar, the kind that bridges years. Then he grew quiet. Mom, I owe you an apology. She frowned gently. Whatever for? For not realizing sooner, he said. How hard this must be for you. Emily and I, we thought we were setting boundaries, but I see now we were building walls. Margaret shook her head. You weren't wrong. You needed your own space, maybe he said, but I could have handled it better. She reached over, squeezing his hand. You're a good man, Daniel. You don't need to apologize for growing up. I just needed time to learn how to let go. He looked at her, then really looked. You never lost me, Mom. You just gave me room to stand. Her eyes shimmered. She laughed softly. That's what parents do, isn't it? Give you the ground you'll one day walk away from. He smiled, though his voice cracked when he said, I'll never walk too far. The days that followed unfolded quietly, tenderly. Emily visited often, sometimes staying for tea or helping Margaret repot her plants. Once she brought a small bouquet, not store-bought, but picked from her own garden. They're not perfect, Emily said, arranging them. They're beautiful, Margaret replied. One afternoon, Emily noticed the stack of crocheted baby blankets in the corner. Did you make those? She asked softly. Margaret nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Habit, I suppose. I started them before I knew if they'd be needed. Emily picked one up, pale yellow, soft as sunlight. Her fingers traced the edges. They're lovely, she whispered. Then, almost shyly, she added, We were going to tell you soon. We're expecting. The words landed like dawn breaking through fog. Margaret's breath caught. You're. Oh, Emily? Tears welled instantly. She reached out, forgetting the sling, and Emily leaned in, laughing as they embraced. I didn't want to say anything too early, Emily murmured. But now, it feels right. Margaret pressed her forehead to Emily's shoulder, overwhelmed by joy and relief. She'd imagined this moment countless times, the news, the hope, the chance to love again through a new life, but she hadn't imagined it would come hand in hand with forgiveness. When Daniel arrived later that evening, Margaret hugged him tightly. You're going to be a father, she whispered. He grinned, eyes bright. And you're going to be a grandma, she laughed, wiping her cheeks. Finally, something I know how to do. That night, long after they'd gone, Margaret sat in her living room gazing at the fading light. The house didn't feel empty anymore. The silence was full of echoes of promises of new beginnings. On the table beside her sat the letter she'd never mailed. She picked it up, folded it carefully, and slipped it inside a photo album beside a picture of Daniel at age 5, grinning arms covered in flour. She whispered softly, We made it, didn't we? Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Somewhere far off, laughter echoed down the street, a reminder that life keeps moving always forward. Margaret leaned back, closing her eyes. Her arms still ached, but her heart felt steady again. Maybe love didn't need to arrive uninvited. Maybe it just needed to wait at the door, patient, quiet, and ready until someone opened it and said, Come in. The first snow came early that year, thin and silvery, as if the sky had decided to breathe out and soften the edges of the world. Margaret woke to quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're inside a snow globe. She made tea, cradled the cup in both hands, and watched the flakes drift past the window. Her phone buzzed at 6:11 a.m. From Daniel, We're headed to the hospital. Contractions started around 3. Roads are slick. I'll keep you posted. Love you. She stood so quickly the chair scraped across the floor. The kettle was still warm when she poured a second cup she wouldn't drink. Her heart thudded, not with panic, something steadier. A readiness she remembered from long ago when a baby's cry could pull her from sleep before she even knew she'd heard it. She typed back, I'm here. Anything you need. A dot appeared, then paused, then disappeared again. She set the phone down face up on the table, forcing herself to breathe. The house hummed around her, the heater, the old clock ticking, the refrigerator clicking on and off, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt too loud for the day. Outside, the snow kept falling. At 7:04 a.m., the phone rang. Mom Daniel's voice was thin with worry. We're okay, we're on the way. But Emily's breathing's a little fast, and he exhaled hard. I didn't think I'd be this scared. You're allowed to be scared, Margaret said, already pulling on her coat with one hand, the other still stiff from the fracture. Slow down your voice, honey. It'll slow down your body. Focus on her breathing. In for 4, out for 6. He swallowed. Right. In for 4, out for 6. You've got this, she said. Drive safe. Mom, he added before hanging up. Could you meet us there? Is it okay with Emily if she wants me? Margaret said softly. I'll be there. He didn't answer for a second. Then, she does. She said she does. The words landed in her chest like a warm hand laid gently over a bruise. All right, she said, grabbing her keys. I'm on my way. The roads were slick, but the city moved anyway, snowplows throwing sparks, headlights cutting pale tunnels through the morning. Margaret drove slow, steady hands at 10 and 2 like the instructor had taught her half a lifetime ago. On the passenger seat, the small bag she'd packed weeks earlier sat ready, a soft robe for Emily peppermint oil, the lemon lip balm Emily liked, tissues scented with lavender, not a mother's rescue kit, she told herself, just kindness offered with permission. By the time she reached the hospital, the snow had settled on the grass in thin sheets. She parked under a light and walked carefully toward the entrance, the collar of her coat pulled high. Her breath puffed white into the air. Inside the hospital smelled like antiseptic and coffee. A Christmas garland drooped over the reception desk. News murmured from a television no one watched. She found the maternity floor and read the signs twice just to be sure. Daniel met her at the elevator, his hair damp with snow. He hugged her hard, then stepped back, sheepish. "I'm okay," he said, which meant he wasn't. "How's she doing?" Margaret asked. "She's in triage," he said, pushing a hand through his hair. "They're monitoring the baby. Everything seems fine. But she's in pain." "Pain means progress," Margaret said, squeezing his arm. "It's the body saying yes." He laughed wetly. "Of course you'd say that." "Where is she?" Margaret asked. He hesitated. "Mom, before you go in, thanks for coming. And I'm sorry for all the times I made you feel like you were on the outside." She touched his cheek, surprised by how young he looked in the fluorescent light. "I'm not on the outside," she said simply. "I'm just standing where you need me to." He blinked tears away and nodded toward the hall. Room 6. Emily was propped on a bed, hair pulled into a loose bun, face flushed. A monitor traced the mountain ranges of her contractions and green peaks. When she saw Margaret, her eyes shone not with relief exactly, but with recognition. "Hi, Emily," whispered, breath catching. "I'm glad you're here." "I'm glad you want me here," Margaret said. She set the small bag on the chair and pulled out the peppermint oil, rubbing a drop between her fingers. "May I?" Emily nodded. Margaret touched the oil lightly at her temples, the scent like winter and sugar. Emily closed her eyes, exhaled slowly. A nurse came in, brisk and kind. "You must be Grandma," she said, checking the monitors. "We're progressing. 8 centimeters. Baby sounds beautiful." 8, Daniel repeated like it was a number he could hold on to. The nurse smiled. "You're more than halfway through the mountains." As the nurse left, another contraction climbed and broke. Emily's hand found Margaret's surprisingly tight. Margaret counted the breath with her. In 2, 3, 4 out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and when it passed, Emily's grip loosened. "You're good at this," Emily murmured. "I remember," Margaret said. "The breathing is half the work. The other half is believing you can do it." Emily nodded, then bit her lip as another wave started. Daniel hovered like someone trying to stand in 2 places at once, at the edge of the bed and at the door, ready to fetch help. "Look at me," Margaret said gently, lifting Emily's chin. "You're safe. You know how to do this. Your body knows." Emily's eyes filled. "I'm scared." "It's okay to be scared," Margaret said. "Everyone is just before the world gets bigger." This time, when the pain crested, Emily leaned her forehead to Margaret's shoulder, the way people lean against strong trees in the wind. "Right here," Margaret murmured. "Right here." Hours thinned and thickened the way they do in hospitals, stretching in the waiting and snapping tight in the moments between. Margaret fetched ice chips, rubbed Emily's back, changed out cold clothes. When Daniel's voice shook, she steadied his breath with her own. When a nurse cheered, Margaret felt pride rise like light breaking through stained glass. There was a moment near noon when the heart rate monitor hiccuped, the baby's rhythm fluttering out of sync. The room sharpened at once. A second nurse appeared. A doctor stepped in. "Baby doesn't like it when you're on your back," the nurse said quickly, turning Emily gently onto her side. "There we go. See back to normal." The line on the monitor steadied and the room exhaled. Daniel pressed his hands to his eyes. Emily began to cry quietly, relief dissolving the hard edge of fear. Margaret stood perfectly still, hands tucked in against her chest, as if holding a fragile bird. She said nothing. She overruled nothing. She asked for nothing. She simply stayed, and staying was everything. By early afternoon, the wind outside picked up, blowing the snow sideways against the windows. In room 6, the light turned pearl gray, as if the world had decided to be gentle. 10 centimeters, the nurse announced. "It's time." Time became a different thing, shorter, deeper. The air felt cleaner somehow, like the minutes had been rinsed. Emily bore down, face pinched with effort, hands gripping both Daniel and Margaret as if anchoring herself to the world. Good, the nurse said. Again. Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. You're doing it. You're almost there. You're not breaking, you're opening. Emily made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Only you would say that. Hold the line, Margaret said, her own eyes wet. Just a little longer. There was a rush of movement, of instructions, of the room holding its breath all at once. And then a cry, thin at first, then fuller, like a note finding its pitch. Margaret felt her heart lift, as if someone had taken it gently in both hands and raised it toward the light. Daniel laughed through tears. Emily's face crumpled into a smile so relieved it hurt to look at it. A girl, the nurse said, beaming. She's perfect. They placed the baby on Emily's chest, small, slick, with newness mouth pursed in furious astonishment at being pulled into the cold, bright world. Emily whispered hello, Daniel repeated it like a prayer, and the baby settled as if she'd been waiting for the sound of those voices all along. Would you like to cut the cord, Dad? The nurse asked. Daniel nodded, shaking, and did as he was told. When the nurse finished, she looked at Margaret. Grandma, she said softly. Would you like to hold her? Margaret's hands hovered. She glanced at Emily, asking without words. Please, Emily said, tears shining. And so Margaret took the child carefully, reverently, cradling her in the crook of her good arm. The baby blinked at her, unfocused but intent, as if the world were a soft shape she was trying to memorize. Hello, little love, Margaret whispered. Welcome. We've been expecting you. The baby yawned an astonished, oh, then settled again. Margaret breathed in the warm, milky scent of her. It was the oldest smell in the world, the smell of beginnings. Something eased long and slow inside Margaret's chest. A cord untangled, a knot loosened. She looked up to find Emily watching her, not wary, not measuring, just watching like someone who had recognized an answer when she heard it. Thank you, Emily whispered, for being here, for knowing what to say. Margaret shook her head, smiling. Thank you for letting me. Daniel slid an arm around both of them, his face open and wet and young again. For a moment, the three of them were gathered in a kind of delicate geometry, mother, son, and the woman he loved, held together by the small, steady heartbeat of a new life. Outside, the wind hummed against the window. Inside, the room felt like a chapel. They named her Lucy Light. It fit the way her tiny fingers clutched a curl of blanket, as if she'd been born knowing how to hold on. The snow stopped by evening. The world beyond the glass turned reflective city lights shimmering on the skin of it. A nurse brought a small paper crown that said, I'm new here, and even Emily laughed at its ridiculousness. When the room quieted, Margaret stood to go. She didn't want to overstay even this. I'll bring dinner tomorrow, she said, then corrected herself. If you'd like me to. Emily met her halfway. Please, she said. And will you come early? I could use your help with the swaddle. Mine looks like origami gone wrong. Margaret's smile warmed her face from inside. I'd be honored. She kissed Emily's forehead, then Daniel's, then brushed the soft crown of Lucy's head with her lips. Sleep, little light, she murmured. The world can wait. At the door, Daniel caught her hand. Mom, he said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, I know she said. He nodded. Thank you for staying in the hallway with us, even when the door was closed. It was never locked, she said. I just had to learn where the welcome mat was. He laughed, surprised. We should put it back by the door. It's already there, she said. You just started seeing it. Spring came in small, generous doses that year, snow retreating in scalloped patches, grass daring to green. Lucy learned the map of her parents' faces. Margaret learned the soft choreography of being needed sometimes, asked often, and present always without pushing. On Sundays, Daniel and Emily brought the baby over. Margaret kept the kettle full, the lemon pie in the oven, the peppermint oil in the drawer in case a headache bloomed. She'd text before she drove anywhere, and Emily would send pictures of Lucy yawning like a lion or gripping her father's finger with the authority of a queen. One afternoon, Margaret spread a blanket on the lawn and set Lucy down beside a row of pansies. The baby stared at the wind chime smitten. A cloud passed. The garden shifted from bright to shadow to bright again. Look at that, Margaret whispered. The world keeps changing. That's how you know it's alive. Emily sat beside her. I'm still learning, she said, eyes on Lucy. How to ask for help. How not to confuse independence with isolation. Margaret smiled, tracing a pansy with her fingertip. I'm still learning, too. How to love without rushing. How to wait without worrying. Emily leaned her shoulder against Margaret's. Thank you for waiting for me. And thank you, Margaret said, for opening the door. They fell into an easy quiet. The wind chime ticked softly, a kind, tinny choir. Lucy stared up at the sky as if memorizing its color for later. Daniel appeared with 3 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to Margaret, one to Emily, then lay down on the lawn, propped on an elbow, grinning at his daughter. She likes the chimes, he said. She likes everything that listens, Margaret replied. He looked over at his mother, then the familiar face, the new gentleness in it. Hey, Mom. Yes, you were right, he said. The breathing really is half the work. She laughed, surprised by how much joy could fit in a sound. It is, she said. The other half is believing you can do it. Lucy kicked once, as if in agreement, then blew a soft bubble that made all 3 of them laugh. For the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't feel like she was standing outside of anything. She wasn't the center. She wasn't in orbit. She was a steady star in a small, bright constellation shining quietly where she was placed. That evening, after they'd gone and the light had thinned into a warm honey, Margaret walked to the spare room she'd once started to paint. The walls were still half sunrise, the brush dry in the corner. She picked it up, rolled her sleeve past the scar of her healed fracture, and set the bristles into the paint tray. She finished the room in an hour, soft yellow, even and clean. She didn't know if Lucy would ever sleep here. She didn't need to know. She'd made a space for light. That was enough. When it dried, she hung a small frame above the window, the letter she'd never sent written in her careful hand, now matted and simple. The last line was visible beneath the glass, and if we ever forget each other, let love be the one to remind us. She stood back, breath steady, heart quiet. Outside, the wind moved gently through the hydrangeas. Inside, the house held its new shape, roomier somehow, not because anything had been added, but because she'd finally put a few things down. Her phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. A photo blinked onto the screen, Lucy mouth open in astonishment, wind chime just above her, a smear of afternoon sun painting her cheeks. From Emily, your swaddle worked. She's out in 5 minutes flat. See you Sunday, Grandma. Grandma. The word hit her with its old, simple truth. A role not taken by force, not guaranteed by blood, but given gently, gratefully when the time was right. Margaret smiled and typed back, See you Sunday. I'll bring the lemon pie. She set the phone down, turned off the kitchen light, and stood for a moment in the doorway listening to the house breathe. It was still quiet, the quiet of a snow globe, the quiet of a chapel, the quiet of a nursery with the light left on, not empty, not any more. Only waiting, only ready, only love learning how to whisper and being heard just the same.